Hello, class. This week we're talking about the mind, free will, the soul, and on this topic is the topic of moral culpability, moral responsibility, and free will, and how those things go together. So something that comes up from a philosophical perspective is this idea of moral luck. And I want to use this argument regarding moral luck to further a case against naturalism. So naturalism is the position that all that exists are physical things. There's no spiritual, there's no God, there's nothing beyond just atoms and molecules crashing into each other, guided by forces. So I want to say that we are moral agents, that we can be held morally responsible and be held morally praiseworthy, so we can do good and bad things. And I also want to say that if naturalism is true, then we cannot be moral agents. So the conclusion would then be that naturalism is false, because if we hold one to be true and naturalism negates one, then naturalism must not be true. So I will be arguing that if naturalism is true, we cannot be moral agents based on this idea of moral luck. This is an idea that came out fairly recently, within the last 50 years, and was put forward by a philosopher named Thomas Nagel. So the two main premises in Nagel's argument are that it's wrong to hold someone morally accountable for something they can't control, and that we do not possess enough control over our lives to be held morally accountable because of this thing called moral luck. Therefore, he concludes there are no moral agents. Everything that we do is neither good nor bad, it's just predetermined. So I'll go into what this moral luck is and how it sort of supports Nagel's conclusion. But his basic goal is to say that morality is self-defeating. So morality as a project, just ethics in general, says there are moral agents. We do good and bad things, and we should try and figure out what those good and bad things are and how we should deal with the good and bad things that people do. Morality also says that we shouldn't be held accountable for things that we can't control. So if someone takes your arm and punches somebody with it and you couldn't stop them, there's no wrongdoing of yours. You did punch someone, but you can't be held morally responsible because it was outside of your control. Nagel wants to say, though, that all of our actions, good or bad, fall under that category, that they're all outside of our control. So in this way, morality would be self-defeating, because it would say, we are moral agents, but we can't be held morally responsible. And then he would say, there's no cases where we can be held morally responsible, then morality itself is a useless enterprise, because there's never a case where it applies. So now I will go into the different types of moral luck that Nagel talks about and how he reaches this conclusion that there are no moral agents. When making his argument, Thomas Nagel relies on 4 types of moral luck to support his conclusion that there are no moral agents. So the first kind of moral luck is consequential luck, having to do with the consequences of our actions. So Nagel points out that we are not under control of how things turn out when we do something. So for example, if we stop on the side of the road to help someone with good intentions, but through some sort of accident we end up getting that person killed, run over by a truck or something terrible like that, then our actions would be judged by most people as bad. However, we would have had no control over our actions. We were trying to do something good, but we're still judged as a bad person because of the consequences of our actions. The second kind of moral luck, constitutive moral luck, has to do with our makeup, our biological makeup. And Nagel says that certain people are more prone to goodness than others. So some might be born more patient, more kind, while others are born more angry, more selfish, and that we judge people morally based on these categories, but they're actually largely out of people's control. So while we think that we're saying you're a good person because you're patient, actually all we're saying is you got lucky because your genes made you patient. The third kind of moral luck that Nagel discusses is circumstantial luck. Circumstantial luck has to do with the sorts of circumstances that we encounter in our lives. An example that Nagel gives is a hypothetical German businessman in the 1930s. In one scenario, the businessman stays in Germany, joins the Third Reich when the Nazis take over, and becomes a criminal and is judged as a morally horrible person. In the second scenario, that businessman moves away to South America for business reasons and lives out the rest of his days in a fairly normal way. So in the one instance, he is a moral monster. In the second, he is a regular person. But he had no control over those circumstances. He didn't see the rise of Nazism. He didn't know that he would or wouldn't join them. So he is just lucky in the second case where he moves to South America, and he's just unlucky in the first case when he stays in Germany. The last kind of luck is determinative luck, and this has to do with the way that we're raised, the culture that we find ourselves in, even just the way that we see other people interacting, like in family units or things smaller than sort of a full culture. So all of these things together, Nagel wants to say, makes it so that we don't actually have the ability to choose right or wrong. That in some sense, our morality is determined by these four types of moral luck. Now, I will go on to argue to say that the naturalist needs to accept this conclusion, while the theist can reject Nagel's conclusion. I'm now going to take a look at some ways that the theist can respond to these arguments that Nagel's making. So, in regards to consequential luck, God is concerned with our intentions, and ultimately God's in control. God's going to bring about those things that God wants to happen in the end. So we don't need to be concerned with the consequences so much as trying to do what we see as God's will. Regarding constitutive luck, there are no moral prodigies. And when I say that, I mean everyone is fallen and everyone falls infinitely short of God and the standard that God has made. So while it might seem that some people are very good and other people are very bad based on their makeup in some way, we all fall very short of God and all require God to redeem us. So we all are basically in the same spot in regards to God, since God is perfect and we are imperfect. Regarding circumstantial luck, I think the theist can say that circumstances reveal our character rather than determining it. So we can say in the German businessman case that he actually was a bad person, even in the instance when he moved to South America, because he was the sort of person that would have joined the Nazi Party. And that's something that God is aware of, that we as humans may not be aware of. And lastly, determinative luck. There are two responses available to the theist, I think, at least two. One is that we can be transformed by God, our relationship to God, our participation in the church and the kingdom of heaven. All of these things help us to overcome our initial circumstances. Additionally, we're made in the image of God, and one part of being made in the image of God seems to be the fact that we have free will. So we have the ability to choose right and wrong because there's some part of God in us that allows us to make choices. Now, these responses to Nagel's claims are not available to the naturalist. no one's in control, according to the naturalist. Consequences are sort of the determining factor. There is no standard of perfection versus imperfection for the naturalist. You are just born who you are, and you're determined by your genes. So in that sense, Nagel is right. If the naturalist is correct, and there is no supernatural, then we're just determined by our genes and the physical forces going on in our brain. Circumstances then really do shape us if the naturalist is right. Circumstances will sort of determine someone's character, and we as people don't have the ability to look at someone's sort of inner person, their heart, their soul. So we're sort of forced to judge them based on circumstances as a naturalist, rather than sort of relying on God. And lastly, according to naturalists, there is no sort of intervening power that will transform us, and there is no free will, because all of our choices are made by our brains, and our brains are just a collection of chemicals that do various things based on our evolutionary history. There's no free will. So, if we do believe that we are moral agents, that we do things that are good and bad some of the time, then I think that we have good reason to reject naturalism. Because naturalism entails that there is no moral agents, that there are not good and bad people. There are just creatures that are placed in certain situations that are acting out the genetic code that was given to them. So as much as we believe in moral agency, as much as we believe that people should be held responsible for the bad things they do and be held praiseworthy for the good things they do, I think that we should reject naturalism and instead accept some sort of theism. Now, this doesn't entail Christianity, but I think it is a good response to people like Richard Dawkins who want to say that naturalism is the way to go. I think that this is a solid sort of counter-argument to that. So hopefully this has been clear enough for you to follow, and it's just one more aspect of this whole conversation of the mind and free will and the soul, and how all of those work together in the theistic framework.